I am Vincent van Gogh, a Dutch painter known for my vivid and emotional works, including Starry Night and Sunflowers. Despite facing mental health struggles and living in poverty, my art has since become highly influential, and I am now regarded as one of the most important figures in the history of Western art. Here are some facts about me. Why do my chosen ones refuse me? Did I cut off my ear and give it to a prostitute? I often ended up in psychiatric hospitals. Only my brother understood me. All facts are truth. I am ashamed of some things, and some things almost destroyed me. However, it is an integral part of my life. It proves that famous people have the same problems and life challenges as everyone else. Now all about it in more detail. Section 1. Why do my chosen ones refuse me? Love, one of the many things I sought in life but could never seem to hold on to. My relationships, much like my paintings, were chaotic, intense, and often misunderstood. I yearned for connection, for a partner who might bring warmth to my cold and lonely world. But love, for me, was elusive. My failures in romance are as much a part of my story as my art, though they are far less celebrated. Take Signe Hornick, for example. She was perhaps the closest thing I ever had to a lasting relationship. Signe was a woman of hardship, a former prostitute with a child to care for. When I met her, I was struggling myself, financially, emotionally, and artistically. I saw in her a reflection of my own pain, and I believed that by being with her, I could save both of us. She became my muse for a time, and I thought we might build a life together. I even cared for her daughter as if she were my own. But our relationship was far from stable. Signe struggled with her own demons, and my inability to provide for us financially only added to the strain. My family disapproved of her and our relationship, especially my brother Theo, who had always been my greatest supporter. He worried that Signe and her burdens would drag me down further into despair. And perhaps he was right. In the end, the relationship unraveled under the weight of its own troubles. Signe and I parted ways, and I was left heartbroken and more isolated than ever. This pattern of unfulfilled love followed me throughout my life. Before Signe, there was Kiva Stricker, a widowed cousin of mine. I fell deeply in love with her, but she rejected me outright. I still remember the humiliation of her refusal. She told me, no, never, never, and yet I persisted, writing her letters and even confronting her in person. My desperation must have seemed pathetic, and eventually, I was forced to let go. Then there was Margot Baigman, a neighbor in Noonan who showed me affection when I returned home to live with my parents. Margot was older than I was, and she too struggled with her own mental health. For a brief moment, I thought we might marry, but my family opposed the idea, and Margot herself attempted suicide. Another potential connection, another collapse into loneliness. Love, for me, was often tied to my need for companionship, for someone to share in my struggles. But my intensity, my poverty, and my erratic nature made it difficult for anyone to stay. I was not an easy man to love. My passion for my art consumed me, leaving little room for stability or compromise. And yet, I never stopped longing for someone who might understand me, who might see the world as I did. Even as I threw myself into my work, my isolation grew. Painting was my solace, but it was no substitute for human connection. I poured my emotions onto the canvas, capturing the beauty and suffering I saw around me. But the more I painted, the more I felt separated from the people I hoped to reach. They saw my work as strange, unsettling, even mad. And so, I remained on the fringes of both society and love. Perhaps my most enduring relationship was with my brother, Theo. He was my confidant, my supporter, my lifeline. It was Theo who believed in me when no one else did, who provided the financial and emotional support that kept me going. But even our bond was not without strain. I leaned on him heavily, and I know it was a burden for him. Yet, through all my failures and heartbreaks, Theo stood by me. Without him, I might have given up entirely. Looking back, I wonder if my inability to find love was a reflection of my own inner turmoil. I was a man of extremes, living in a world of vivid colors and stark contrasts. My art was an extension of my soul, raw and unfiltered, and perhaps that intensity was too much for anyone to bear in close proximity. I wanted to be loved, but I didn't know how to be the kind of man someone could love in return. Even now, as I reflect on my life, I see how my longing for love and my dedication to art were intertwined. I sought beauty and meaning in both, but I often ended up with only heartache. My paintings, with their vibrant colors and emotional depth, were my way of reaching out, of saying, "This is how I see the world. Won't you join me?" But the world, it seemed, was not ready to join me, nor was any one person. In the end, my art became my greatest love, the only thing that stayed with me through all the rejections and failures. It was my way of making sense of a world that often felt cold and indifferent. And though I never found the romantic love I craved, I like to think that my work carries some of that longing, some of that deep, unfulfilled desire to connect. Perhaps, in that sense, I am not entirely alone. Section 2, Did I cut off my ear and give it to a prostitute? Ah, yes, the ear incident. It has become one of the defining anecdotes of my life, overshadowing so much of what I sought to accomplish and express. People are fascinated by it, perhaps because it shocks, perhaps because it feels like a tangible sign of the torment within me. But to reduce it to a symbol of madness does a disservice to the complexity of that moment and to the life that led up to it. It was December 1888, and I was living in Arles, in the south of France. I had come there with high hopes, seeking light, color, and inspiration. More than that, I dreamed of building a community of artists, a space where we could work together, share ideas, and push the boundaries of our craft. I imagined it as a place of harmony and creation, a refuge from the loneliness that so often plagued me. Paul Gauguin, an artist I admired deeply, agreed to join me. I looked forward to his arrival with great anticipation, convinced that we would find in each other the camaraderie and collaboration I had long sought. For a time, we did. We painted side by side, shared meals, and talked late into the night about art and life. But the differences between us soon became apparent. Gauguin was confident, assertive, and often dismissive of my ideas. I, in contrast, was sensitive, intense, and consumed by my vision. Our debates, which began as invigorating, grew increasingly heated. He favored a more abstract, symbolic approach to art, while I clung to my love of vivid color and raw emotion. Each of us was certain we were right, and neither of us was willing to yield. By December, our relationship had deteriorated into constant tension. The arguments escalated, and I found myself feeling increasingly isolated, even in his presence. One evening, after a particularly bitter quarrel, Gauguin announced that he intended to leave. His words felt like a blow. To me, his departure was not just the loss of a friend but the collapse of my dream. The artists' community I had envisioned would not come to be. I was devastated. That night, something inside me broke. My mind was a storm of anguish and confusion. I can't fully explain what happened next. In a fit of despair and self-loathing, I took a razor and severed part of my own ear. I wrapped it in a piece of cloth and brought it to a woman at a nearby brothel, someone I had known casually, someone who perhaps represented, in that moment, the human connection I so desperately needed. Why her? Why at all? These are questions I have asked myself countless times, and I still have no clear answers. The physical pain was sharp but fleeting compared to the emotional torment that followed. When I returned home, I was overcome with exhaustion and collapsed. The next morning, the authorities found me and took me to the hospital. There, my wound was treated, but the deeper wounds, the ones in my mind and soul, remained untouched. The people of Alls, who had already viewed me as an eccentric outsider, were horrified by the incident. They signed a petition calling for my removal from the town, labeling me a danger to myself and others. It was another rejection, another confirmation that I did not belong. Gauguin, too, left shortly after, and we would never see each other again. His departure felt like a final betrayal, though in truth, I cannot blame him. Who would want to stay after witnessing such a scene? In the years since, the story of that night has been told and retold, often stripped of its context, reduced to a sensational tale of madness. But it was more than that. It was the culmination of years of loneliness, frustration, and mental instability. It was an act of despair, yes, but also of desperation, a cry for help from a man who felt increasingly lost in the world. The incident marked a turning point in my life. It led to my first admission to a mental health institution and deepened the rift between me and the community I longed to be a part of. It was a low point, one of many, but it was not the whole of who I was. I ask you to see beyond the act itself, to consider the context, the man behind the myth. I was not simply the artist who cut off his ear. I was a man struggling with profound pain, a man who sought beauty and meaning in a world that often felt harsh and unkind. My art was my way of making sense of that world, of finding light in the darkness. If the story of the ear incident must be told, let it be told with understanding. Let it serve as a reminder of the complexities of the human spirit, of the struggles that often lie beneath the surface. And above all, let it not overshadow the work I left behind, the paintings that, I hope, convey the depth of my emotions far more eloquently than any story ever could. Section 3. I often ended up in psychiatric hospitals. My mental health, it's impossible to speak of my life without addressing it. My struggles with the mind were as much a part of me as the paint on my canvas. They shaped my days, my relationships, and even my art. People often see the product of my work, but few understand the battle behind it. I had dealt with bouts of emotional instability for as long as I could remember, but it became worse as I grew older. In 1889, after the infamous ear incident in Arles and the growing hostility from the townspeople, I admitted myself voluntarily to the asylum at Saint-Paul-de-Marseille in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. It was both a retreat from the world and a prison of my own mind. Saint-Paul-de-Marseille was a former monastery, repurposed to house those society deemed mad. The setting was serene, a quiet countryside with olive groves, cypress trees, and the gentle hum of nature. Yet inside its walls, I was confronted daily with the reality of my condition and those of the others around me. Some of the patients' cries echoed in the halls, their suffering a mirror to my own. My time there was both a curse and a strange blessing. On good days, I was allowed to paint, and the gardens and nearby fields became my subjects. The Starry Night, one of my most famous works, was born during this period. From my window, I gazed at the swirling night sky, the crescent moon, and the silent cypress trees. It was a moment of beauty amidst turmoil. Yet, even as I painted, my mind often betrayed me. The doctors at St. Paul tried their best, given the limited understanding of mental health at the time. I underwent treatments, some of which were more harmful than helpful. Bathing therapy, a popular method then, was used to calm me, but its effects were temporary. The deeper causes of my condition, whether it was psychosis, depression, epilepsy, or something else, remained a mystery, even to me. There were days of clarity, but they were overshadowed by longer periods of despair and confusion. I experienced hallucinations and delusions, which terrified me. I often felt trapped between moments of lucidity and an uncontrollable descent into darkness. The isolation, though self-imposed, weighed heavily on me. I longed for connection, yet I feared being a burden to others. My brother Theo was my lifeline during these dark times. He visited me when he could, and his letters were a source of comfort. He provided not only emotional support but also financial assistance, enabling me to continue painting. I poured my soul into my letters to him, describing my struggles, my art, and my unending hope to find peace. Despite the challenges, I managed to produce some of my most remarkable work during my time at St. Paul. Irises, Wheat Field with Cypresses, and The Bedroom are all from this period. My art became my way of coping, of making sense of the world when my mind could not. Yet, each brushstroke also carried the weight of my suffering. After nearly a year at the asylum, I left in 1890, hoping that a change of scenery might improve my condition. I moved to Auvers-sur-Oise, where I sought the care of Dr. Paul Gachet, a physician who was also an art enthusiast. But even there, the shadows of my mind followed me. My struggles with mental health were not just personal, they reflected the broader ignorance of the time about such conditions. I was seen by many as mad, a label that stripped away my humanity and reduced my suffering to a spectacle. Even now, people speak of my art and my madness, as if they are inseparable, as if one justified the other. But I did not create because of my illness, I created in spite of it. Looking back, my time at St. Paul was a paradox. It was a place of safety and restriction, healing and despair. It gave me the space to create but also reminded me daily of the fragility of my mind. It is a part of my story, just as my art is. Together, they tell a tale of a man searching for meaning, for connection, for light in the darkness. Section 4, Only My Brother Understood Me. Ah, my brother Theo, he was my constant, my greatest supporter, and at times, my greatest source of guilt. Our relationship was the backbone of my life, yet it was not without its strains. Theo believed in me when few others did. He saw the potential in my art when the world dismissed it as madness or mediocrity. But I also know that my struggles weighed heavily on him. From the very beginning, Theo and I shared a bond unlike any other in my life. He was not just my brother but also my confidant, my patron, and my emotional anchor. Through his letters, he offered me encouragement and advice, and in return, I poured my heart out to him, sharing my thoughts, fears, and hopes. But those letters, hundreds of them, also reveal a complicated dynamic. I was entirely dependent on Theo, not only emotionally but also financially. My attempts at other careers, whether as an art dealer, teacher, or preacher, ended in failure. I could not fit into the molds that society expected of me, and this left me with no means to support myself. Theo took on the burden of providing for me, sending me money regularly so that I could continue to paint. It was not an easy task for him. He had his own life to manage, his own career to build, and later, a family to care for. Yet he gave selflessly, even when it strained him. I often worried about the toll I took on Theo. I knew that my dependency caused him stress, especially when my mental health declined. He would write to me, urging me to take better care of myself, to seek treatment, or to find stability. But my nature was restless, and my mind often too chaotic to heed his advice. I could sense his frustration in some of his letters, even if he rarely expressed it outright. There were moments when I feared that I was a burden too heavy for him to bear. He had his own struggles, his health was fragile, and his work as an art dealer was demanding. Yet he never abandoned me. Even during my darkest days, when I was hospitalized in St. Paul de Mosul, Theo remained my advocate. He visited when he could, wrote to me frequently, and continued to provide the materials I needed to paint. His belief in me never wavered, even when I doubted myself. Our relationship was not without tension. I was acutely aware of the sacrifices Theo made for me, and this awareness sometimes turned into feelings of guilt and inadequacy. I wanted to succeed, not just for myself but for him, to prove that his support was not in vain. When my paintings failed to sell, when critics dismissed my work, I felt that I was letting him down. That guilt often deepened my feelings of isolation and despair. Theo's unwavering support came at a cost to him as well. I could see it in the way he struggled with his own responsibilities, the way he balanced his work, his marriage, and his commitment to me. His wife, Johanna, must have felt the weight of our relationship too. Yet she, like Theo, showed kindness and understanding, even preserving my letters after my death. When Theo himself fell ill, I felt a profound sense of helplessness. He had given so much to me, and I could do so little for him in return. His death, just 6 months after mine, felt like the final chapter of a story intertwined with love, sacrifice, and sorrow. Our relationship was complex, a mixture of deep affection and unavoidable strain. Theo's faith in me was the foundation of my life, yet I know I tested that faith many times. He was my greatest ally, my most devoted supporter, and perhaps the only person who truly understood me. Without Theo, there would have been no Vincent van Gogh, as the world knows me today. My art, my legacy, they are as much his as they are mine.